A group of women from the Regent Street Polytechnic went to compete in the very first, what was called the Women's Olympiad in Monte Carlo. And this was expressly set up because women weren't allowed to compete in the athletics events in the kind of mainstream Olympics. And so they decided just to have their own one.
Hello, and welcome to Different Conversations, where every week we have a different guest, academic, staff member from the University of Westminster along to talk to us about their work, their research, what they're doing at the moment, and what's interesting, newsworthy, and, well, for lack of a better way of putting it, different. If you're enjoying our podcast, feel free to follow along on Twitter or even our blog online. I'll make sure the link for that is below. But that's not what you're here for today. You're here to hear about archiving and archives, which is a topic that I'm willing to admit I didn't think was going to be as interesting as it was when I started doing research into this. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our guest for today. And with us today, we have Anna.
Yes, so my name's Anna Mcnally. I'm the Senior Archivist at the University of Westminster.
Why does a university have an archivist? What's an archivist do?
So I've been at the university for 11 years, and I was originally brought on board to celebrate the university's 175th anniversary. So although we've only been a university since 1992, the university has actually been in existence since 1838. And along that way, obviously, we've produced a lot of documents, we've taken a lot of photographs, and all those things have come into the archive to enable us to kind of understand the university's history and understand where we've got to today. So I help the university to bring materials into the archive, and then I describe those materials, and then I help people to find and use them, either for research or for teaching or for exhibitions or for any other reason that people might come and use the archive.
1838.
Yeah.
I forget that about Westminster because we are a relatively modern university. We gained our status in 1992, but like you say, we've existed in some form or another for, I can't do the maths that quickly in my head, since 1838 at our same site, at our same location in Regent Street.
Yeah, so we were the first thing on that site. Regent Street was built in order to link up Regent's Park with Charing Cross Station, and it was built as a very fashionable address. And so 309 Regent Street was built as the Polytechnic institution, which was a place where people could go and see sort of scientific demonstrations during the Victorian era. So you've got lots of new science being invented at that time, things like electricity, things like the diving bell. You know, you could go and see these for the very first time. And as you can imagine, it was hugely popular in Victorian London. It developed into having a Magic Lantern Theatre, which is now the Regent Street Cinema today. And there was an opportunity to go and see sort of live demonstrations and lectures by some of the sort of foremost names in Victorian London. So over our time, we've been a sort of variety of different institutions. When that closed, we then became the Young Men's Christian Institute, which then turned into the Polytechnic Regent Street. And that was an evening institute. So you would go after work either to do sports, to do social clubs, or to take evening classes. And those could be evening classes in a whole variety of subjects, but they were always very practical, and they were there to sort of help you get along in your job. And then after the Second World War, we moved more into kind of daytime education and gradually turned into the kind of more of the further and higher education that we think of today. And that included turning some subjects that originally hadn't been thought of as degree level into degree level subjects. So we had the very first photography degree in the UK because we were able to argue that photography was actually a degree subject and not just a diploma.
I love so much of that. Such a big part of my academic job these days is public engagement. And indeed, it's kind of why we're here talking at the moment. And there's that ethos of showing, of engaging, of conversing with the public that stretches all the way back to precursors of the cinema, which, like you say, is still there today, or these seemingly magical technologies that we're introducing to the world. I just love that so much. And it's such a cool part of our history that when I found out about, I think it's so interesting.
I think one of the things about having this kind of campus right in the centre of London is it's always been this very kind of permeable campus. So we've always been inviting people in. And that was one of the things when the Difference Festival started a few years ago, that has now obviously evolved into things like this podcast. It was about trying to say, well, you know, how can we continue to invite people into our campus and to be involved with what we're doing in the university? Because our location at the centre of London has always been so much about sort of part of our identity as a university, and allowing people that kind of, you know, it's not an ivory tower. It's very much a place where people can come in and they sort of get sucked into the university. They come in to do, like, maybe, you know, you come in to do an evening language class and before you know it, you're doing a PhD. So, you know, it is one of those places where people, you know, we've always been very welcoming, and we've always allowed people to come in for, you know, and try things out and learn new things.
I love that. It's being sucked into it. But you're right. You're so right. And like, even the way you put that, like, we're not an ivory tower. We're not separate. We're not over here. We are very central to our community. I really like that. And that's very, very, very true. And I was going to ask you about history, and I was going to ask you about your favorite pieces. And we're going to come to those questions, I promise. But there's something you just triggered there that I hadn't even thought about asking you about. And so apologies if this is left field. But when we talk about the work we're doing at the moment, when we talk about current things we're showing the public, do you still capture items, archivable things, objects, pieces of future history at the moment? Is that a part of your role, saying that we're doing right now, that should be archived for the next generation? Is that a part of your role as well?
Yeah, and it's become increasingly important with the digital because most people, I think, sort of in the back of their heads, they think digital objects are more permanent, but actually they're far more temporary and more ephemeral than paper objects. So most websites, for example, usually last less than a year. So you have very short amounts of times to capture things. And within the university, because we have this kind of regular turnover of, you know, particularly of students, we've always been very aware of having to grab things as they're created. So things like kind of student magazines, you know, they're produced in very small numbers, and those are a really important record for the university to really understand what our student community felt at any particular time. So we've got an amazing collection going back, you know, I mean, to some extent going back really to the 1880s, but ones produced by the students starting in the 1940s right up to today. And collecting those has always meant kind of running around the building, just kind of grabbing things as and when we find them. And particularly with the student elections each year, of course, that's a wonderful snapshot of what students cared about at that particular moment. So I've always had in my diary kind of, you know, when the elections finish, I literally wait until 1 minute after the polls close, and then I run around the building and pull them off the wall, and they're going to the archive. And we have to do the same thing with digital, because if you don't capture it at the minute pretty much that it's created, there's a chance that within a couple of years you won't be able to open those files. And they can also very easily be deleted. You know, it's quite easy for people to see it on a server, or for the server to get upgraded and people not even be aware it's on there. So we have to be so much more aware of what we want to collect. And I think there's an idea of archivists as being very backward facing, but actually I see my role as very kind of future facing. I'm always thinking about what are people in the future going to want to, you know about what's happening now, and trying to make sure we collect that. So with the university's website, we had an arrangement with an external commercial company where they capture the website for us twice a year, because obviously that gets updated September and January with all the details of new courses. So we had that in place. And then last March, we realized that obviously the website was being updated far more frequently with things happening around COVID. And rather embarrassingly, as a professional, my first thought was like, oh no, that completely ruins our web archiving strategy. You know, regardless of what else was happening in the rest of the world, you know, I realized that, you know, that page was being updated every couple of days. I only had a couple of days in which to capture that. So we had to start a kind of rapid response collecting policy where we just did kind of quick, sort of fairly quick and dirty captures of those web pages to make sure that we had a collection of what was happening around the university, because everything was changing so quickly.
You're right. Like, I had come into this thinking we were going to talk about history primarily. We were going to talk about how you put it, backwards facing. I'd never considered the fact that your job was collection as well. some sort of like Indiana Jones type role of running around rescuing these things before they're lost, which is now we're going to have some sort of in-joke about this for the rest of your career, I think, unfortunately. You're basically Indiana Jones. This is amazing.
I mean, when I first started at university, there were things around the buildings that had been there since the 1920s, and the buildings were so kind of undisturbed in a way that people would open up cupboards and just find, stuff relating to the boxing club from the 1908 Olympics. And they would phone us and they'd be like, oh, we've just found all this stuff. So there was, and that was it. We're talking only like 11, 12 years ago, that the buildings were still kind of, producing this historic material. But I'm fairly confident we've captured all that now. But now it is kind of making sure we capture what we need from what's going forward. But it's also trying to get people to understand the type of documents that we need, because we'll regularly get phone calls and emails about giving certain things to the archive. And a lot of the time, people don't necessarily understand the type of things we might want. So they think, we'll want kind of printed documents and things like that, which quite often, usually we've got copies of them already, they're produced in multiples. And then they'll just say casually, I've got an old staff phone book. I presume you wouldn't want that, because as far as they see it, it's superseded. But in the 1970s, the only lists of complete members of staff that were produced were the phone book. So it's about us understanding what information is contained in a document, as opposed to thinking about like what use necessarily did it have at the time. It's about us kind of looking at that document and saying, well, does the information within it continue to have use? And obviously it's no longer useful as a telephone directory, but it tells us every single person within the university, not just academics who are listed in the prospectuses at that time, but also all the technicians, and all the kind of back office staff. So it really gives us this amazing picture of what the university looked like at that time.
It sounds like real detective work. It's just, generally speaking, it must be just like a lot of, well, like you say, this is a completely unexpected resource, or unnecessary resource to me, but to you, it's incredibly valuable. That's really cool.
The kind of inquiries we get, we tend to have to kind of think quite laterally about how we're going to look for that information. So, people will come to us with a very specific inquiry, and the information is generally not stored in a way that, might be useful to today. So, a really obvious one is examination results, where people think that they can give us, their surname and their student number and their date of birth, and we'll look it up in a computer. But actually, the examination results from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s are all stored, in paper folders, organised by year and then by course name. So it actually means going through, you kind of almost need to know the information before you find it. You need to know what degree they got and which year in order to be able to find them in there. And so if you don't have that information to start with, it's a real hunt to try and find it.
So what does your normal day look like then? Is it hunter-gathering, things like this? Is it spent in archives somewhere? Do we have some sort of mythical Indiana Jones style warehouse full of these really cool things?
We do. So in the little Titchfield Street building, we're down in the basement. There are very practical reasons for being in the basement, because in terms of the floor loading, obviously large amounts of documents get heavy very quickly, and the temperature stays remarkably stable. So we've had a couple of really, really hot summers, and the temperature has only fluctuated in our stores by a couple of degrees. And because we're in the basement, that's also meant we've been able to think about the environment and turn off the air conditioning units in there, and actually just use the natural cooling abilities of the building to keep the documents at a steady temperature, which has been great. We do have this store, and on a normal day, sort of obviously pre-COVID, it's very much about kind of moving between lots of different tasks. So we get inquiries in from members of staff. We get a lot of inquiries in from researchers at other universities who might want to say reuse our images or organise to come into the archive for a protracted period of time to do some research. We get inquiries from people whose sort of families have connections. So, for example, their father might have studied at the university, and they might be writing an obituary, and they want some details about that. We've even had inquiries from people recently to do with the Windrush, where they needed to use their university records to prove that they had a right to stay within the UK. So, it can vary between sort of lots of different things, from kind of very detached academic research to kind of very personal reasons why people might need to access those records. And then we're also then trying to encourage people to use them. So part of that is creating things like catalogue records so people can find them online, but it's also writing blog posts and then going out and supporting teaching and learning within the university by taking materials to students and helping them to understand how archival research works.
And so we're going to go ahead and put a link to the blog post in our description below, so people can find that and then find you, of course, because that's the kind of cross-posting we like to do. Do you have a thing, an item, a discovery, a find, a favorite thing? Have you got a thing that you came across and went, wow? Is there anything like that that's been a real mind blower when it's happened?
There's been loads, to be honest. I mean, when I arrived, the collection wasn't catalogued, so there's been a lot of opening up boxes that, as say on the outside that there's something really boring, and I'm finding they're far more interesting inside. And for example, with the university has a campus in Harrow, and the history there goes back, that goes back to the 1890s as well. It was founded as the Harrow School of Art, and the art courses have always been really important at that site. But unfortunately, we have very few records from Harrow College and its predecessors. And so that's always been a real shame. When I was looking at some of the records, I had a couple of volumes that were marked as press cuttings, and so I didn't bother looking at them for ages. I just thought, oh, they're just going to be press cuttings, there won't be any use. And then when I went and flicked through them, I found loads of original photographs, of fashion courses from the 1920s and ceramics courses from the 1930s, and realised I probably should have looked at these much sooner. So really, items can really surprise us when we go and look at them. And I think that's one of the things I try and get students to see, is that, what's written on a catalogue, can often not really convey what how wonderful a document's going to be when you actually see it. And that's one of the problems with archives, is because we have to have this kind of mediated access through an online catalogue. There's no way you can go and browse the archive, that you're always sort of working through somebody else's description. And so we try and get students to, by taking the documents to the classroom, try and get them to think through what it is that they're looking at and how they might learn to interpret those catalogue records.
I think that makes sense. And like you say, it must be actually really, I can see that being really difficult. This is this item to one person, but to me coming along as a researcher, I'm seeing completely different meanings behind it, or uses, or reasons why it's useful to me from my detective research point of view.
And we can't really predict what those research interests are going to be, because obviously things change all the time, and the kind of new research interests arise. And so we try and predict as far as possible, but then there's always someone who comes in with an entirely new angle, which is what you're hoping they'll do. Archives are there to be constantly reused and rediscovered, and to bring out kind of new perspectives in them. But it means that it is very hard as archivists to make that description in advance. So, we have to work with researchers and really help them trying to think through who might have recorded that information and how was it recorded, and even was it recorded at all. So we've been working a lot with the university's BME network to do the Black History Year events this year, and sort of we've been asked questions, things like, when was the first Black student studying at the university? And we have no way of knowing, because that information just wasn't recorded. No one recorded ethnicity until really things like the Race Relations Act came in the 1980s. So we know there were Black students studying at the university much, much earlier than that, but there's no way of telling from the records who those students were. So often the information to some extent is really kind of lost to history, that those people are there in the records and they're recorded, but you can't necessarily find the information you need to distinguish them.
There's so many ways I want to take that question, so many different variations of that exact question. Like, was there anything that everyone just looked at and went, well, that doesn't matter, and we kind of put that in the corner? Then a researcher came along and completely changed the nature of the thing. Has that happened before? It's more kind of that there's been you find that people are coming in with kind of new ways of interest. So, for example, one
of the sportsman at the university is now being acknowledged as the very first Black Olympian to compete for Great Britain. His records have been there the whole time, but no one has been interested until recently, and so it is that kind of, so that information sits there and then just waits for its moment, really, for people to acknowledge that those people are there.
So the Olympics then, our title reason, the reason I wanted to bring you in today, the reason that we first started talking, it wasn't ethnicity, it was sex and gender. For a long time, women were excluded from the Olympics. And you found something really interesting in our archives recently about this.
Yes, so we, in 1921, a group of women from the Regent Street Polytechnic went to compete in the very first, what was called the Women's Olympiad in Monte Carlo. And this was expressly set up because women weren't allowed to compete in the athletics events in the kind of mainstream Olympics. And so they decided just to have their own one. And as an institution, we've got a really long history with the Olympics that we've always shouted about a lot, particularly in 2012 when London hosted the Olympics again. So in 1908, the Regent Street Polytechnic was very involved with hosting the London Olympics. And we organised a lot of the test events, particularly the test event for the marathon. And so the route that was run by the marathon was organised by our runners. And that race became so famous because it had a very famous finish that a few years later, when they were deciding on a permanent distance for the marathon, they picked that route. And so that's why you have this kind of slightly strange 365 yards on the end of the marathon distance. That's because it's based on the distance of the route organised by the Polytechnic Harriers. So we've always been kind of had this great Olympics history that we've talked about. But around 8-9 years ago, we digitised a group of material called the Polytechnic Magazines. And these were weekly newsletters produced by the Polytechnic for its members. And one of the great things you can do with digitisation is really kind of open up content. Because if you're thinking about kind of 80 years of these newsletters, going through them page by page, trying to find information is really time consuming. Whereas obviously digitising them and then allowing a text search across them, you can suddenly dig out all these new stories. And through this, we found these kind of couple of small articles about these women competing in the 1921 Olympiad. And so the British women's team was comprised of half students from the Regent Street Polytechnic and half from, I think, South Bank Polytechnic. And so they travelled down to Monte Carlo by train and they competed, and the British team won most of the golds. And the majority of those were won by one of our sportswomen called Mary Lyons. And then they came home, they had their pictures in the papers, and then that was kind of it. And they went back to their day jobs. But as a result of this, they founded the Women's Athletics Association in Britain. And, really kind of the start of the women's sports movement in Britain is the first time women have this official representation. And a lot of that comes, out of the Regent Street Polytechnic and the fact that we were always very supportive of women taking part in sport at a time when it was considered incredibly unfeminine and possibly quite unhealthy for women to be doing these things. But what's remarkable is the kind of, on the one hand, the institution at the time celebrated these women, and on the other hand, they then went back to, their daily lives, and there was very little record of it. And so we decided this year, with the 100th anniversary of that event, that it would be really good to try and sort of make people aware of the fact that this had happened, the fact that there was this long history of women being excluded from the Olympics and from specific events. And, just try and sort of raise a bit of awareness of the fact that you've got this kind of alternative history of women's participation in sport.
It was so fascinating when I was reading about this, because I had no idea this had even happened. I had no idea it was part of history. This Mary Lyons, like you say, she wasn't just dominant. I looked it up beforehand. I don't know these things, obviously. She won 5 gold medals. She won a silver. There was, of all the events, I think she personally won the majority. She seems like she was this incredible athlete, just dominant at the time. She sounds amazing.
Yeah, and within the buildings of the university, we've got there's a lot of kind of plaques up. So for anyone who's been into 309 Regent Street, they'll know that there's kind of, it's a very historic building. There's a lot of plaques on the wall. And one of them is a board that commemorates a prize we gave out every year for the best sportsman. But even though on the one hand we were very supportive of women's sport, we did, the winners of that were all men. And so there hasn't been this recognition kind of literally physically within the building of the things that women had achieved. And I think the thing that really frustrated me when I first started looking into this is that Mary Lyons is featured in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, but on a page called Women Athletes Between the Wars. So she's considered to be, sort of good enough to have her own, to be featured in it, but not to have her own entry. And all the women are kind of included together, which I just think is one of those kind of, I think that's a bit of a shame to, to really kind of not recognise their individual achievements.
Yeah, she had a lot of them. Yeah. It's like, it must have been an amazing team because it was multiple Western European countries primarily.
Yeah.
And they did this multiple times before they got any sort of official recognition, right?
Yeah, they just basically kind of kept hosting them until they were allowed to compete in athletics in the kind of main Olympics. And then, because it then got subsumed into the Olympics, it kind of, this story, there's no one there really to tell that story. The Olympics Association, is there promoting and, recognizing the history of the Olympics. But when you've got something like this that's kind of, fizzled out, the records are really dispersed. And so, there's no one central place where you can go to research this, and no one really kind of banging the drum for its history. It's kind of trying to piece together information from a lot of places.
Do we know what happened to Mary after she came back, after she went along and showed everyone else how to do sport?
She carried on competing for several years, and then, like a lot of women at the time got married, and and then retired from sport. And I think this is the thing. I think particularly when you're looking at sports records, people have this kind of very short window of participation, and really until recently, it was a very amateur thing. So I've been lucky to do oral history interviews with people who competed in the 1948 Olympics from the Polytechnic, and it was very much they went to work, in the evening they went along and did their Olympics events, they slept on a bunk bed, and then they went back home and went back to work the next day. And it's only really recently that these things have become these kind of massive events. And I know we have a lot of people in the university working on that kind of the real sort of spectacle aspect of these big sporting events, and we try and with those students we get them to come in and look at the records and see kind of just how recently that's changed from when people were participating in the 1948 London Olympics, that it was very much more a kind of homespun thing as opposed to the Olympics now.
It's just so different, isn't it? It's so interesting what they must think if they could see what the Olympics look like today, what global sporting events are to now, the showcase, the effort, the commitment, the training that people put in, the life that they commit to it. It's such an interesting story, and I'm so glad we can showcase it just in some way. And we're going to continue showcasing it a little bit this year. I hear there's a poetry crossover going on as well.
Yeah, so we're working with students from and staff from within the creative writing department, which it doesn't sort of at first sight seem like a great fit. But poetry is really something else we have a very long history of at the university. So as the Polytechnic, we were teaching poetry, and we had poets like Ezra Pound coming in to teach. And we, it's always been sort of there on the curriculum, and it's a really nice way to kind of showcase both those aspects of our history, really. And we're very keen that, that the archive isn't just there for historical research, that it's there to generate new work. And so we're giving these students a paid opportunity to be commissioned to develop work based on the archive. So it's giving them lots of great skills and an opportunity to kind of showcase their abilities.
At the risk of sounding a bit like I'm corporate advertising for the university, isn't that just characteristic about our Westminster difference? We've got sport, we've got poetry, literature, history, and all these different disciplines tied in together, which is genuinely something I do like about Westminster and our work that we do. Very, very cool. It only really remains for me to say thank you so much, Anna, for talking to us today. I've learned a lot about your role, about archiving, how the university does it, and just so many interesting stories that you must find in your work. So thanks for coming along today.
Thank you for having me.
If you've enjoyed today's podcast, feel free to subscribe. If you're watching either along on YouTube, or if you're listening in on the audio version of this podcast, on whichever audio channel you are following us along with. You can also find us on Twitter, where you can join in the conversation in real time, or even read more about some of the stories we talked about today, or any of our other podcasts on our blog, all of which you can find linked down below. My name's Brad Elliott, and this has been today's Different Conversation.